Hi, I'm Stephen Wolfson. I'm the Copyright and Research Services Librarian for the University of Georgia Law Library.
And I'm Mariann Samuel. I'm the head of scholarly communication and copyright services at the University of Georgia Libraries.
And today we're going to be talking about copyright in the time of COVID, or why you should care about copyright right now, and what our experience has been during the pandemic. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to cover today. So why does copyright matter? Why does it matter even more so than normal, maybe in the time of COVID? Well, there are a few reasons we think this is a particularly important topic to talk about right now. The first is that, so in the rapid move to social distancing, and then as schools move to distance education, we dealt with a lot of issues, how to deliver services to our patrons, things like this. But one of those issues has to do with copyright, right? How do we deliver educational resources without implicating legal problems? And as it turns out, copyright in the electronic space is sort of an even stickier issue than it is in normal educational space. And the second question that's raised, and it's directly related, is the question is, do our rights change because of the pandemic? Or do we understand copyright and our rights to use things under the copyright statute differently now than we did a couple months ago? And then related to that, of course, how can we continue to provide our resources without worrying about copyright problems?
So basically, we have 4 points here: that the technology that enables the delivery of education for distance learning also triggers copyright questions that aren't necessarily raised in the face-to-face education context. That electronic resources are managed by contracts or licenses, which is a type of contract that basically define our rights to use them. So there's another layer in addition to copyright, which is contracts that we have to consider. The face-to-face teaching exception to copyright covers a lot of uses. However, the distance learning exception is not as helpful as fair use, which we will discuss, because it has a lot of regulations and specific ways to use it to make it really useful. Um, and we don't necessarily know how fair use applies during the pandemic because it hasn't been legally tested yet in this context.
Okay, so let's talk about that first point. So we say that distance learning technology raises additional copyright questions that may not be as big of an issue under sort of normal face-to-face education situation. So the question is, why is that, or why do we say that's true? The reason for this is that it's usually best to think of copyright as a bundle of rights rather than as a single right. That is, copyright grants authors or copyright holders a number of ways that they can control their creative works. And that online distribution raises additional questions, again, that aren't typically typically such a big issue in a face-to-face situation. So let's look at this copyright bundle of rights. So we usually think of 6 different rights that copyright grants authors or copyright holders. So first is the reproduction right, and that's kind of what most people think of as copying something. So it's the right to make copies of a work, creation of derivative works. So these are works based on the original work. Then there is the distribution right. There's the right to public performance of a work, the right for public display of a work. And the difference between these two is that you might think of public performance as like the playing of a song to a group of people in public, or let's say a reading of a passage from a book, again, to members of the public. And public display, you think of this as like showing or transmitting to a group in the public. Or of the public. And then finally, the 6th right is for sound recording, specifically public performance by digital transmission. And under the sort of face-to-face education situation, we can normally think about maybe we implicate the reproduction right, maybe the creation of derivative works, and maybe the distribution right, but that's really it. We don't really worry too much about public performance, public display, certainly not public performance by digital transmission. Those things just don't normally come up as much, or we're not so concerned about them. But because of how digital technology, distance learning technology works and digital distribution works, all of these rights are implicated. So reproduction, the way that computers work, they are continually reproducing things, which does count as a copy under copyright law. Creation of derivative works, you might think of a derivative work in a distance learning education as just using, some portion of somebody else's work in your presentation that you make, something like this. Distribution, again, this is just kind of how digital distribution works, is that things are naturally copied and distributed. And then, of course, they're distributed to the public often, or displayed to the public. And then if we're thinking of sound recordings, again, public performance by digital transmission. So where we might only have to worry about a couple of these rights, now, because of distance learning technology, we have to worry about potentially all of them.
So our use of electronic resources as in normal circumstances, and especially so during a pandemic, is of course managed through license agreements. So these are subject to state laws. They supersede copyright law, which is maybe surprising, but because it is contract, there's the concept of freedom of contract that's based in our Constitution. Contracts are given more, they trump copyright in this particular context. So even though you might be thinking that my particular use, even during a pandemic, involves fair use and I should just go ahead and do it, we also want to rely on what our license agreement says, because that will trump copyright. Additionally, you may want to be wary of the DMCA, which prevents breaking of any sort of DRM measures. And of course, there may be exceptions, but you should be definitely aware that you don't want to go around electronic, measures that protect DRM. So what about copyright exceptions for teaching? The main focus that we want to rely on, the main exception, is of course fair use, which is section 17. We want to put that in context with exceptions such as the Teach Act, 110.1, 110.2, which have a lot of different requirements. They are not necessarily, as fair use functions, a defense to copyright infringement, but rather they may lessen infringement. They're more elaborate in their provisions, that basically they are a safe harbor. So if an institution infringes copyright but has followed through on all of its provisions, in effect, it may lessen its infringement, but it doesn't defend against it as fair use functions. So fair use is a much better tool because it is flexible, it's a qualitative standard, and it is a complete defense to infringement. It's also an affirmative right. So the law says if you are acting within this particular context, fair use is your affirmative right and also a defense to copyright infringement.
Let's talk a little bit about fair use now. So fair use is an exception that to copyright liability that most people have at least some familiarity with, or people who work in in the space have some familiarity with. And one question that people who work with academic copyright asked was, should we think about the fair use exception to copyright liability differently during the pandemic? And the reason for that is that copyright. The purpose of fair use is to give some flexibility to the otherwise sort of draconian rights of the bundle of rights of copyright, right? So to allow people to use copyright protected works without having seek permission from the author. And there's a question of, again, whether we should understand it differently now, because of this rapid transition to distance learning, but also because it does educational purposes, do they have some sort of special position, within fair use or within our understanding of fair use? So as I already mentioned, fair use is an exception to copyright liability that allows us to use copyright protected works in ways that benefit the public. And we know that one of the reasons why fair use exists is because ultimately copyright, or the purpose of copyright, is so that authors create works so that there's a benefit to the public. The fair use exception can be found in 17 U.S.C. 107. And you see I've written it out here. And I want to focus for a minute on this, on the preamble. So the first section here, it says, notwithstanding the provisions of 106, it says that the fair use of the work may include some things, including such as criticism, comment, news reporting, and teaching, right? So teaching, again, has some, it is at least mentioned as something that fair use supports. And then typically when we're conducting a fair use analysis, when we're trying to decide whether a use is fair or not, we not only think about the preamble, but then we go into these four factors. And in fact, the courts have told us that we need to weigh all of these factors each time we conduct a fair use analysis. And no one single factor is determinative, but in fact, we sort of weigh them all and we decide whether the use is fair or not, whether on balance it comes out towards using the work or whether it comes out toward the author, right? So first there's factor number one, the purpose and character of the use. So that's what are you doing with it? And here this very much supports fair use during the pandemic, right? Is that the purpose of the use is to support teaching when we can't otherwise get people these resources, right? It's impossible or improbable, right? The nature of the work, it considers whether the work is fiction or nonfiction or published or unpublished. Typically, courts don't give too much weight to this, but with a lot of academic works, we're thinking of nonfiction works, so that actually would support the idea this would be fair use. The amount and portion of the work, substantiality of the portion of the work. So this is how much of the work are you using. Typically fair use, various ways toward using less of a work rather than more, but you can potentially use all of it and still be fair use. And then four, the effect on the market of the use. And again, I think this is something that could potentially favor fair use during the pandemic because there is no sort of market understanding, or there's no market provisions for licensing something on this rapid of a level. Now, if things go on for a long time, maybe that changes, but at least for the immediate rapid transition to distance education, I think that certainly supports, or at least is an argument in favor of fair use.
So at UGA, we developed a statement, a fair use statement for our university to follow or as guidance when the University System of Georgia decided to move the in-person instruction fully online for spring semester. And the main takeaways from our guidance statement was that the law itself hasn't changed. We're still falling back on fair use. It's entirely untested, and we may have a bit more leeway than normal, but until and unless the courts decide a fair use case during the pandemic, we don't really know. We're just kind of making our best guesses. The approach that we took at UGA was fairly conservative in the language in which we crafted the statement. And we also specifically talked about that the guidance is limited with regard to the time, the distribution, and the scope of the material that we're making available. And just also interestingly enough, the shortly after the statement was released, we completely closed it physically so that the scanning work that was happening using the statement as guidance actually ceased shortly after that. Um, so there's a fair amount of big open space that we're not really aware of what's going on.
So, and this is the statement itself, and you'll see that, reflected within here, this idea of limitation in duration, how long the copies exist, put behind a password wall, things like this. In distribution, so only distributed to the class to the amount they need, and only distributed in the scope, so how much is necessary to achieve, the educational purposes that they're serving. And so finally, I think we want to end on what we should take away from this time. And we came up with at least 4 different bullets here. Um, and so first is that I think that we should feel that we can make flexible use of copyright protected materials to support distance education during this time, at least, in the immediate wake of the pandemic. But additionally, going forward, again, what there certainly is a public benefit both to education, but also to, social distancing, to providing materials to people so that they don't have to physically interact. Um, but I think second, we don't want to go overboard on this use. And that's kind of what's reflected in our statement, right? And what we've been saying is if something seems like a bad idea, it probably is, right? So streaming a full studio movie via Zoom, that doesn't sound like it's going to be the best idea in the world. But providing copies of portions of textbooks to students that they need to study for exams or conduct coursework, that feels more okay. But then we want people to think about how much they need, how long they need it, and whether they need it all. So a lot of times when people come looking for a copy of something, they'll say, I need this for my course, or I need this, to study from, or whatever. And the question that it immediately raises in our minds, and Mariann, in my minds, is, do you actually need that? Like, how much of that do you truly need? Can we cut some of it back? Can we trim it down so that, again, looking at the third factor in fair use, we're only using what we need to use? And then finally, always remember that fair use is a case-by-case analysis. So we can't really draw any generalities other than the kind of high-level ones that we issued here. You always have to consider, whether your use is fair or not. So that's all we have for you right now. Thank you for listening.